John McMullen here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Of course, John is brought to you by Harrah's Resort, Bally's Atlantic City, Wild Wild West. They're taking bets at the new sports book. Break up with your bookie and wager today at the book. Gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER. John, do we see a team that is starting to have some cracks in the armor that are becoming concerning?
I don't think so, not yet. It's like an old school overreaction Monday. I'm pretty excited. It's almost like February didn't exist. It's so long ago.
Hey, it happens quick in this league.
Yeah.
You know, we had Barrett on earlier. He won the Super Bowl with Pittsburgh in 2006. He said the next year they went 8-8, so it happens.
No, yeah, and I think Doug talked about sense of urgency. And there were so many reporters there, I never got to ask about that, about what he meant, because that was the most interesting thing to me. Is he trying to say there was no sense of urgency on one particular day in situational football, or is it bigger than that? I think that kind of stuff is legitimate. The fact that I talk about it all the time. It's not just Philadelphia, but it's all over this league. People get myopic about their particular teams, and they don't look around the rest of the league and see the trends. Look, it's difficult to play defense in this league. I talked about it all week with the Tennessee Titans. They're better than you think they are, especially on the offensive line. So we talk about styles make fights. Jack Conklin was back. All of a sudden you have Taylor Lewan. Very, very rarely do you face two tackles like that. From the Eagles' standpoint, where they usually have a big advantage. So that kind of went out the window. And then I think Tennessee threw them a curveball. Everybody came in there expected to get punched in the mouth, and all of a sudden they start throwing the football all over the place. So I think the Eagles got surprised a little bit. But, yeah, I don't think it's time to panic. Not at all.
Well, you wrote about the next man up finally failing the Eagles. So if it's not time to panic and the next man up failed, are there some changes that you would like to see, or changes that you think might be coming?
Well, Doug intimated and talked a little bit about personnel changes. I don't know if that's an overreaction. I was speaking on one particular week. Look, the Eagles are so used to, let's be honest, average to below average players stepping up. That rolling that dice had to end at some point. And I think it ended with Corey Graham and then Jim Schwartz, which I thought was the most interesting part of the game, using Avonte Maddox as a center fielder in that dime package. He's got a lot of talent. Eagles like him. They've been consistent. But he's small. He's a small guy. You saw a 5'9" guy against a big rangy receiver. A lot of times in this league, that's not going to work out very well. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of what happened. But I think when you do the post-mortem of this particular game, obviously you look at the fourth down calls and fourth down plays in overtime. And this team has been so good in situational football time and time and time again. And all of a sudden yesterday, it evaporated. So if that continues to be a trend, then you get concerned. I don't know if it's going to be a trend.
John, what has this team shown you through 4 games for this not to be an overreaction, or for this to be an overreaction? Like, what are you hanging your hat on today, besides them being Super Bowl champions?
Well, I'm hanging my hat on the fact that's where I was talking about the myopic part of a particular fan base. I mean, people are going crazy because the Eagles couldn't stop the passing game. I mean, you look at this league, there were 13 quarterbacks who threw for over 300 yards this week. There were a record to throw over 400. There's a record through 4 games over 400. Let me give you the stat of the day, guys. Joe Montana retired with the highest passer rating of all time at 92.3 in anybody's list. That's either the best quarterback of all time or he's certainly in the top 2 or 3. I think we could all agree on that. You look at today's game, the average starting quarterback in this league has a higher passer rating than that. It is impossible to play defense at times in this league. Mitchell Trubisky threw for 6 touchdowns. I mean, that's what I talk about when I say myopic. These are problems all over this league, and the Eagles are far less than most teams when it comes to stuff like that.
Yeah, no, we had this discussion last week when talking about Ryan Fitzpatrick and, he's thrown for 400 yards. How do you go away from him? I said, well, the league, everybody's throwing for 400. Like his 400 yards, yeah, it's great, but it's not as impressive as it sounds because of the rules of the league. And I was trying to kind of get that point out that, yeah, I'm impressed by his 400 yards, but that's what the league is now. Everybody's throwing for 400 yards.
Yeah, it's really, really difficult. So what it comes down to is these 4th down plays, these 4 or 5 plays each and every game. I thought it was going to be a 1-score game. It turned out to be a 1-score game. Anytime you have one of those, it's going to be those 4 or 5 plays that decide it. If you look at the 4th and 15, that's just bad situational football by a veteran player. That's probably not going to continue. Corey Graham's seen a lot in this league. If you look at the other 4th down with Sidney Jones and the pass interference, that's 50-50. I thought it was a foul, but sometimes that's not going to get called. If it's at Lincoln Financial Field, you're probably walking off a winner, to be honest. And then on the last one with Dion Lewis, borderline block in the back of Jordan Hicks and poor tackling. So you're talking about razor thin plays going the opposite direction. Eagles fans haven't been used to that. Eventually, the odds catch up to you. I think they did in Nashville.
John, what are your thoughts on how Doug called the game? 50 passes, 18 rushes. Mike and I talked about it earlier in the show. Did you think the run game was going well, or are those stats a little bit misleading? And how concerning is that moving forward? Basically, what's your takeaway from that?
Well, that's another thing. Philadelphia fans have to stop. We just talked about it. They have to stop talking about run-pass ratio in this league. It's pass, pass, pass. If you want to question something, why is he running the ball in overtime when he had a chance to put the game away? He should have run the ball less, to be honest. So run-pass ratio is out the window, completely out the window. Look at the leading rushers in this league. Ezekiel Elliott had a big game yesterday, way ahead. Then it's Todd Gurley. Then everybody else. There are teams that run 10 times in this league. Kirk Cousins led the Vikings in rushing against the Rams. Andrew Luck led the Colts in rushing, I think, against the Eagles. Forget about running the football in this nonsense. If you run the football, you're going to guarantee yourself losing. Now,
what about up 17-3?
Well, yeah, if you're up, that's where the situational comes in. So if you don't have the turnover, look, you should never lose a 14-point lead, even on the road, if you take care of the football. Then you start talking about running it. Then you talk about shortening the clock. But I think overall, that kind of stuff is out the window. It really is when you talk about run-pass ratio. That's the personality of a particular game.
All right, what about home-road splits on the defense? At what point, okay, I'm arguing the side of, look, if they play poorly at home against the Vikings this week, maybe I heighten my concern more. As of now, I'm not that surprised. This is what happens. They're on the road. They're not as good.
Yeah, exactly. It's tough to win on the road. It's tough to be on, and I agree with you, but that's not going to happen. And I said on Twitter, I pulled the Aaron Rodgers. I said, relax. 11 days from now, the Eagles are going to be 4-2. I firmly believe that. There is no way the Eagles are losing at Lincoln Financial Field to that mess of a team in Minnesota. There is no way, even though it's on the road, that horrible New York Giants team is going to beat the Eagles. They're going to be 4-2 in 11 days, and everybody's going to be happy again.
When you look at, and I said this earlier too, like, okay, the defense, 4th down, 15, these are some things in overtime. Realistically, shouldn't we be more concerned about why the offense can't put up more than 20 points in four quarters in that game?
Well, yeah, I mean,
and I'm not
I
discounting
think
Tennessee. I'm just saying there were plays to be made that they didn't make. There were drops. There were some plays. I mean,
it was an ugly game.
Yeah.
It was an ugly game from Nelson Aguilar's standpoint. And we all kind of know Nelson by now. I talk about it all the time. He doesn't track the football well. And when he drops it early, it affects him more than it should. And that's just the reality. So you can, next week, if he catches the football early, he'll be fine. He's never going to be a deep threat. He is what he is. That's going to get better as Alshon, who was a bright spot in that game, gets more involved. And he was great. He saw the difference between having a receiver that can actually track the football and do some things with his body and the back shoulder throws. So that's all going to get better. The offensive line, I also talked about that's the first time they saw a 3-4 this year. The multiple looks, you don't know where the pass rush is coming from. That hurt, I think. They blitzed a ton. And then the underreported stuff nobody talks about is Darren Sproles is the only running back on this team that can pick up a blitz. And it's been that way for a while. They masked it last year. Sometimes you can't mask it. They do not have anybody in the backfield that can pick up a blitz when Darren's not playing.
So, John, what's the one thing this week that the Eagles are going to be working on? Because, all right, they go on the road, they give up some points, they lose the tough game. For me, there was a lot of issues. Like, what do they need to change this week? Are you just chalking it up to they went on the road and they lost? That's the league. They're going to bounce back. Like, or what needs to change here moving forward before it becomes a trend?
Well, I say you look at games and they're sort of their own little microcosm. This was a difficult matchup for the Eagles because of the tackle, because of the style of the team, because of the 3-4. Now they go back against a team that plays a traditional 4-3. They're used to it. If you saw the Vikings play the Rams, it's like they never saw pre-snap motion. Nobody's better at pre-snap motion than the Eagles. The Vikings have a terrible offensive line, which plays into the Eagles' defensive line. So I guarantee you we're going to be having a different conversation next week at this time. And by the way, people are going to get too high because the Eagles are going to look good as opposed to being too low because they didn't look very good against a team that created some problems. To me, the biggest issue, you can't give up that much passing yards to Marcus Mariota. You can't. I mean, you could say you're surprised by the curveball early, but then you got to adjust. This is a guy who came in, I think, with 200 passing yards in a league that we just talked about with all the passers getting 300 and 400 yards. This is, on the other hand, this is one of those games similar to Tampa Bay. I mean, we saw Tampa Bay up close. If they played that game against Chicago 9 more times, they're not going to play like that against Mitchell Trubisky. Sometimes particular players have it one day, and I think the Eagles ran into that.
That's what concerned me, and I'm trying not to overreact. I'm trying to take your advice, John. But like we talked about it leading up to the game, that the Titans are going to make it ugly. They're going to pound the ball. They're going to make it ugly for you on the offensive end. But like you just mentioned, they threw the ball 43 times. Mariota was slinging it. He led the team in rushing. Like, he was getting out of the pocket and making plays. Like, that's where I look at the game today, and I'm like, that's a game that they should have won. And that's a game that they lost. If they were going to lose, I didn't expect them to lose it that way, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And that's where I said they threw him a curveball, and I understand being all caught off guard by that early. But they should have adjusted. And Jim Schwartz talks about it all the time. He laughs at people that talk about halftime adjustments. And he said, and he talked about this week. He said there are no halftime adjustments in the NFL, which is true. I've talked to that with a number of coaches. People overblow that. There's adjustments through the entire game. After drive 1, drive 2, you're constantly making adjustments for what the other team is doing. And the Eagles didn't do it well defensively. I mean, yeah, you have to stop Marcus Mariota throwing the ball. I mean, the difficulty with him is obviously the running game and his ability to do things that way. So you're in for a long afternoon if you can't stop them throwing the ball. I think the Eagles should have went in a less aggressive direction. I thought for most of the game they did, and played a lot of coverage, which is difficult to do, I understand, in today's game because it's so difficult to play coverage, and you're going to pick up penalties. And you can name the names. You all saw it, Jalen Mills, Corey Graham. A lot of guys didn't play well. Ronald Darby is in that category as well. And Sidney Jones, who I think at times showed he should be outside, which I've talked about for a long time, but even he had some issues. I don't think it was the best day for the secondary.
John McMullen at JF McMullen. Yeah, secondary, Mills is a guy that we talk about a lot, but I think, too, Corey Graham, as you mentioned, he's a veteran, yada, yada. Is he better equipped and better suited to kind of have a smaller role, or will he improve as his role gets bigger, or do they need to seriously consider finding someone there?
Well, Earl Thomas is off the table, so that dream is gone. But yeah, I mean,
there's
both.
not. By the way, I checked the free agent wire. I mean, you got nothing out there.
Yeah, well, there's a reason you're not employed at this point if you're on the street. But both of the things you said, he's better suited to not play as much at this stage of his career, and he's going to get better. Both of those things. They're not mutually exclusive. The reality is he's a 33-year-old guy. He's being forced into a full-time role. That's what this league is. This team won the Super Bowl without its starting quarterback, without its quarterback on defense, without its left tackle, and on and on and on and on. I mean, you can't tell me you're losing Carson Wentz and Jordan Hicks and Jason Peters and Darren Sproles, and you can't overcome the loss of Rodney McLeod? I don't know. I think eventually they'll figure it out, and that's not a shot at Rodney McLeod.
That's a good point, though.
Yeah, it is.
He's a good player, and they will miss him, but that's something they'll figure out. I firmly believe it.
How about this? I mean, and I threw this out right before you came on, John. I think it might be something that hasn't been brought up a lot, but I know Torrey Smith didn't have great numbers, but he was a presence. Mike Wallace was supposed to be that guy. Him and Wentz never got a chance to play. Is that the kind of weapon, even if the guy doesn't catch a pass, that offense is missing? Yeah,
they miss it. They miss it badly because you do have to respect Mike Wallace, even if he doesn't catch a pass. Same as you mentioned with Torrey Smith. You got to respect guys who can run, and they do stretch the field, and they don't have it. And that's the one thing the Eagles behind the scenes have kind of said that is different from this year's injury versus last year's. Last year's, it was all over. It was a quarterback, it was a middle linebacker, it was a left tackle, it was a kicker, was a special teams guy, on and on and on, but different positions. This year, when you look at wide receiver, they keep getting banged at wide receiver. Alshon is obviously back. That will help immensely. But also Mike Wallace and Matt Collins. Nobody even talks about Matt Collins anymore. Mm-hmm. He's another guy who can run and stretch the field. And they lost for the first 3 games. They were out 3 of their 4 top receivers that they were supposed to be. So that's been difficult. But now that Alshon gets back, it will get better, but you would prefer to have that guy who can run. And they don't have that right now. Nelson can run, but he can't catch the darn ball down the field.
Real quick, I know this has been intimated and hinted at, but Frank Reich, voice of reason maybe, to say, hey, Doug, relax, or Doug, try this. I mean, does Doug maybe not have that trust in the intuition of Mike Groh just yet?
Yeah, that's fair. I've been talking about that for months and months and months, and people just glossed over it. There's a reason. It's the same with players. There's a reason there's starters and there's backups. There's a reason Frank was the offensive coordinator. John DeFilippo was the quarterback coach, and Mike Rowe wasn't the offensive coordinator, and Press Taylor wasn't the quarterback's coach, because they're not as good as coaches at this point as the guys they're replacing. Happens all the time in this league. We all know it, but there's going to be growing pains. There continues to be growing pains. Yeah, he's not Frank Reich, and he's not going to be for a while. So that's something you have to overcome as well.
All right, Eagles lose 2-2. They are a half game behind Washington. They are technically behind Dallas in the East. Both teams are 2-2. The Giants 1-3. So the Eagles currently, if the playoffs were to start today, would not be a part of that field. We'll see them. I'll tell you what, this Minnesota team, they got to be fighting hard, man. They lose to Buffalo, then they go on the road to lose to the Rams. They go to 1-3-1 with a loss here. This is kind of a rematch. This game is going to show you what this team's made of, at least. Both teams, what they're made of.
Yeah, I mean, the Eagles don't lose at home. And again, when you talk about styles, I think Minnesota will get better. I mean, but they're just not equipped to match up with the Eagles because they have a bad offensive line, and that plays into exactly what the Eagles do well. So I just think it's a terrible matchup from their standpoint.
Yeah.
And then the second part is their defense, which I can't explain because they have a lot of talented guys over there, has just completely lost its mind.
And maybe that's part of your point. That's part of the point, is that defense has got a lot of talent, and yet people are still throwing the ball all over. That's the game today.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Jared Goff had a perfect passer rating against that defense. Perfect. 158.3.
Who's going to be the NFC Player of the Week, Goff or Trubisky?
It's funny you say that because I said bet your house on Jared Goff being the NFC Offensive Player of the Week. And guess what? You're going to lose your house because Mitch Trubisky's going to be
complaints to J.F. McMullen on Twitter.
I was just going to say, John, I was going to start taking your advice, but I guess I'll hold off.
We'll have plenty more on the Eagles and Vikings rematch coming up this week. John McMullen at J.F. McMullen. Don't forget, Mosher, McMullen, and Krause Thursday night over at the Landmark. It's a great show. Been great turnouts. I've been hearing great things about that. And that's Thursday night. We'll have John, of course, tomorrow throughout the week with the latest on the Eagles and the Vikings. All right, man. Losses are fun sometimes.
Yeah, it creates interest. So from our perspective, it's actually good. But, whisper that. Don't tell people that.
Don't tell people that. All right, pal. We'll talk tomorrow.
All right, thanks.